I am Laura Dixon, and you are listening to the Naturally Thin for Life podcast, episode number 155, Transition Time Eating Habits. Welcome to the Naturally Thin for Life podcast. I'm going to teach you how to get out of your diet brain so that you too can be naturally thin for life. No counting, restricting, or obsessing. I am going to take the mystery out of it for you so that you can become naturally thin starting today. Are you ready? Let's do this. Hello, friends. Welcome to this week's podcast episode where we are going to talk about these sometimes subtle, little sneaky snacking eating habits that crawl into our lives during what I call transition times. So food sometimes we think about when we're transitioning from activity to activity. So if you are between tasks at work, or when you notice maybe when your kids come home after their activities of the day, when you're transitioning from being maybe out and about, taking them to all their events and then coming home, your brain wants to eat something in that moment. Maybe when your kids get home from school or between meetings or right before you know you're about to have a really difficult conversation, or after you completed a big project at work before you go on to the next thing that you want to get done. Or after your kids are in bed and the dishes are done and the house is tidied and you're transitioning into quote unquote relaxing time. So for some of you, this may be a subtle habit, and maybe for some of you, it's not so subtle at all and it's really obvious. And it doesn't matter if it's something you notice infrequently or something that feels like it has a really strong hold over you. I'm going to walk you through in this episode why this happens and why it's so important, regardless of how apparent or not it is to you, that you work through this, because it has a significant implication in your weight loss journey because of the skill required to overcome this. And for me, I used to notice this all the time, really, now kind of looking back, where I would need to have like a fresh, really hot, warm cup of coffee when I used to drink coffee. I don't drink coffee anymore, but like a warm, fresh cup of coffee, and it had to be the perfect temperature with the perfect amount of cream, and it had to have the perfect color like before I would be able to get started working for the day. And I used to always want to do the easy things first, meaning I'd be like, okay, I'm just going to, turn on my computer. I'd get to the office, turn on my computer. I'm just going to answer emails first. And when I say answer emails, it was more like, let me look and see all of my emails, and I'm just going to answer the few that seem really easy, and I'll come back to the hard ones later. And it was like my brain really needed this long sort of like winding up exercise to be able to dive into work. And it was not that I was like severely procrastinating. Like I for sure used to do that, where I would just like watch a TV episode before I needed to like study for my CPA exam, and I would just like completely put it off. But these more subtle ways where we are kind of procrastinating, but we're still doing something. So our brain kind of gets in this trap of thinking like, well, but I'm being quote unquote productive, but you're not being as efficient as you could be. And our brains love to do this to us, and then they love to sometimes use food as a way to kind of sneak into it. And so I was coaching someone actually in the Naturally Thin for Life program, and she was working from home more than she had usually been because she was off for some days during the holidays. And she just kind of noticed herself kind of like sneaking into the kitchen, and not sneaking, but just kind of feeling like a little, I'll just have a little something before I get back to my work. And it's so common. So I want to talk about why it happens, and then I'm going to give you some very tactical solutions on how to overcome this. And here's how it sounds for a lot of us in our mind. It will sound like, just a little bit. And I know I said this before, but this is how my non-naturally thin, how my brain, when it wants to like circumvent what I like deep down know to be true, it has like a little bit of a higher pitch to it. So my brain will be like, just a little bit. It won't make that much of a difference. You're pretty thin anyways. It's only just a nibble. It's just a few bites. It used to sound like, it's only a couple of calories. It doesn't really matter that much. And while it doesn't truly matter if we are looking at the calories, which I never look at calories of anything, but I want you to think about, even if your brain is like, well, I mean, in that high-pitched voice, just an apple, it doesn't really matter anyways, but it does really matter. And the reason it matters is it can become a habit. It can also become a quote unquote like significant habit that does impede your weight loss. And what you're missing out on, though, in this opportunity is your ability to feel really in control of what your brain is telling you. And when you take back control of what your brain is telling you, even in these subtle ways, you will feel so much more in control. You will see how just because your brain offers up to you a sentence like, just a little bit, it doesn't really matter anyways. Just because your brain is saying that doesn't mean it's necessarily true. And when you don't allow yourself to see why you're doing this, why you are eating when you're not hungry during transition times, then for some of you, and I used to feel this way, I started to feel like compelled or like I needed to eat the snack before I would be able to do something. I started to feel like kind of a little bit like my hands were tied and like I had to have this perfect cup of coffee with the perfect amount of cream before I could even get started on my day. And now that didn't mean I stopped drinking my coffee and that right now I still drink my tea, but I don't need it in order to be able to do something challenging or to be able to do something that requires more mental energy and effort. And so what I want you to see is that you don't need the food, you don't need the snack, you don't need the couple bites of chocolate to go on to the next activity, because as long as your brain has any part of you that believes that's true, then you don't have the true freedom of being naturally thin. And that freedom comes when you don't ever need food to escape even the slightest bit of dread. When you truly just eat when you're hungry and you stop when you're satisfied, and that's how you think about food. So as long as your brain thinks that you need to have that little snack before a difficult conversation or before you take on the next project, you're missing out on the opportunity of seeing how truly in control you are of your own mind and your own brain, and you don't need the food. What I want for all of you is to want to eat, of course, when you are hungry, to want to eat food that feels good in your body, to want to easily stop eating when you're satisfied, and then to move on and just live your life. So one of the primary reasons this happens, this transition time eating habit, is because your primitive brain is designed to seek pleasure, to avoid pain, and to not exert any energy or effort. It will sound like, I don't want to do that. This is why for a lot of us, sometimes it feels like a little kid, like throwing a temper tantrum. Like, I just don't want to do that. Or why your brain will tell you that it's going to be so hard, right? That's how it sounds in my brain. It's like very like whiny, like it's going to be so hard. It's going to take so much energy, so much effort. That is our primitive brain. And our primitive brain's job is to stay the same. Don't do anything different. Don't do anything that's going to require any energy and effort. So like if you have to dig into a big pile of data that you need to make sense of, or you have to solve a complicated problem at work, but you don't exactly know what the solution is, but you got to like get in there and talk to some people and go through a bunch of spreadsheets and do some research and figure it out or review a really long white paper. Your primitive brain isn't like, yay, this sounds amazing. But you have another part of your brain. You have your prefrontal cortex that actually enjoys problem solving. It actually enjoys exerting energy and effort. It enjoys the accomplishment of figuring something out, of doing something that is really challenging. And so we have these two parts of your brain. And when your brain wants to avoid having a difficult conversation or reviewing a white paper or going to a meeting, and it wants to avoid that with even just a little bit of food, what you're missing out on in that moment, in that opportunity, is your ability to turn on your prefrontal cortex and tell that primitive part of your brain, shh, be quiet. I don't need you right now. And so that's what I want you to take away more than anything from this episode. And there's one other reason that I see this happening for myself and for all of you. And it is mostly where we have kind of like a slight dread, where our primitive brain is like, oh, I know I'm going to have to exert some energy and effort. But sometimes this transition time eating habit can come to the forefront, can come to the surface when we potentially know we're going to get bored, right? Which is so ironic because our primitive brain is like, I don't want to do anything. That's what my brain sounds like. I don't want to do anything. I want to sit there and do nothing. And when I think about what that would be like, I'm like, okay, I would be bored in about 30 seconds. And so it could be on the opposite end as well, where our brain will maybe perceive that there is some pending boredom. And our brain is like, oh no, as much as we don't like exerting a lot of energy and effort, we also really don't like being bored. So we should probably have a snack right now. That would be really good. That's what it sounds like sometimes in my brain. And so when this happens, what I want you to do is I want you to notice it. I want you to catch it. And I'm going to give you some very, like I said earlier, tactical solutions to redirect your brain. But the biggest way that I have overcome this for myself is I simply think about myself about an hour from now, or even 15 minutes from now. I remember writing very complicated, long white papers, then reviewing other people's work in these white papers. And I would think to myself, okay, my brain, my primitive brain, this is way before I ever knew coaching or knew anything to the extent that I know today. But I remember being like, okay, do I want to eat some peanut M&Ms and feel even the slightest tinge of discomfort as I get started reviewing or writing this white paper right now? And I'd be like, nope, me in 15 minutes is going to be really glad I just got started. So I would literally just think about me in 15 minutes from now. Do I want to be reviewing this white paper feeling discomfort in my body, or do I just want to be reviewing the white paper? And I'd be like, I think I just want to be reviewing the white paper. And I still have this part of my brain will offer up thoughts to me when I do something that I really enjoy. And so this part of your brain will never go away, ever. I keep thinking it will, but it doesn't. I just have gotten so much better at communicating with it, at recognizing it, and by really learning how to just calm it down and be like, we're just not hanging out right now. You and me, meaning me, this part of my brain that really is just offering up to me like little lies. So when I think about little ways this still shows up, I will want to go for a walk. And I love going for a walk. I love the fresh air. I feel so much better. During my walks, I often think about all of you. Sometimes I think about what I want to share in a podcast episode. And I love being naturally thin. So I love thinking about what I'm going to teach you. I love thinking about how to help you get to the result you want faster and more efficient. And I sometimes listen to audiobooks that I'm just super intrigued in, or a podcast that I love. So there's no part of the walk that I'm like, oh, it's going to require so much energy and effort. But my primitive brain is still like, oh, do we have to? Are we really doing that today? And so to this day, even though I love a walk, I don't force myself to do anything that's like really super uncomfortable in my body. I'm not like running because I hate running. My brain is still like, oh, I don't want to. And it sounds very whiny. And so I don't ever make it a problem that my brain says that. I'm like, oh, that's just the primitive part of my brain that wants me to lay down on the couch and I don't know, be bored in 60 seconds. And so I'm like, oh, you forgot you do actually want to go for your walk. Remember how we go and we walk and we enjoy the fresh air. And then all of a sudden my brain's like, oh yeah, that's right. I do really enjoy that. And so I want you to do this as well. Anytime your brain tells you that, hey, we should eat a little bit right now, even though we're not hungry, or hey, we should eat a little bit past the point of being satisfied because I know there's this thing I'm going to do in a few minutes and I don't really want to do that thing. And so what I want you to do is ask yourself, okay, so what do you want to have happen an hour from now, 2 hours from now? How do you want to feel going to bed tonight? And I love to remind myself this. I said this a little earlier. I love to remind myself that just because my brain says I don't want to review this white paper, I don't want to go for a walk, my brain is not a truth teller. And when it has any like, whine or dread or temper tantrumness that it sounds like in my mind, which it does, and also the high-pitched voice, when it has either of those, I know it's not a truth teller. It's just a sentence in my brain. It's mostly the primitive part of my brain that doesn't want me to do anything. But the real truth is that I want the result of the activity. I want the result of going for a walk, of enjoying the walk. It's not even having the walk be done, but I want the result of being out in the fresh air. I love it. I want the result of having reviewed the white paper. I want the result of having the difficult conversation with a coworker be done for the day. I want the result of having this podcast recorded and sent to my editor so it can be out there for all of you, right? I want the result of the activity. And so when I remind myself, well, I can either have the result of the activity while feeling physically radiant and energized, or I can have the result of the activity feeling a little physically lethargic because I ate when I wasn't hungry, or I ate past the point of being satisfied. And when I think about it, even an hour from now, I want the result of the activity. I want it to be done in the most efficient, effective way. And I want to be feeling physically energized, physically radiant. I don't want even a subtle amount of physical discomfort from eating when I wasn't hungry, eating food that didn't serve me, or eating past the point of being satisfied. I don't want any of that. And when you're really honest with yourself and you remember, well, I'm going to do this thing anyway. I'm going to review this white paper. I'm going to have this difficult conversation. I'm going to go for the walk. I'm going to record this podcast episode. Do I want to be doing that thing with any physical discomfort? And my answer for me is always no. So even though these thoughts can often be very subtle, like, I don't want to do that. It's going to be so hard. Ugh, I hate this. This is so boring. I would rather be doing something else. Those thoughts may be seemingly subtle, seemingly nuanced. It may even sound like your brain is telling you the truth, but first and foremost, your brain is not telling you the truth in that moment. It's just offering you up a sentence in your brain that you've decided to believe, you've decided to latch onto. And those thoughts create very subtle, sometimes it's pronounced, but for me, it's often very like subtle dread, subtle angst, subtle anxiety, subtle overwhelm. And what you want to remember and remind yourself is it's not the actual activity that leads to transition time eating habits, that leads to you eating when you're not hungry, but in transition between two activities, or that leads to you overeating and eating past your optimal satisfaction level because your brain has a little bit of dread about what you're going to do next. It's not the actual activity of, I'm just going to keep using some of the examples I've used for me. It's not the actual activity of writing the white paper, recording the podcast, going for the walk, having a difficult conversation with a coworker. It's not that actual activity that has you turning to food. It's a negative anticipation that has your brain looking for food. It's the negative anticipation coming from these thoughts like, I don't want to do that. It's going to be so hard. Ugh, I hate this. It's so boring. I would rather do something else. It's those thoughts that create a slight or pronounced dread and angst and anxiety and overwhelm. And those emotions in your body have your brain saying, ooh, I don't like this dread. So let's find a temporary reprieve. Let's find a temporary escape. And it turns to food as the solution. And it's so fascinating, right? It's not even the activity itself that's creating that in your body, creating the dread. It's the negative anticipation of it. And how we know it's not the actual activity is because you're not even doing it yet, right? You're just thinking about it. And what's so ironic as well is usually it's around things that we want to actually have accomplished, right? We want the result of them. I want the result of the walk. I want the result of the podcast being done. I want the result of the white paper being done. So we actually want the result of the activity. It's just your brain lying to you, telling you, oh, it's going to take so much energy and effort. And it might take energy and effort, but you actually really enjoy problem solving. Your brain actually really enjoys kind of once you're in there. It's just the like ramp up to get you started. And all that's happened is just your primitive brain has kind of taken over and it's created a heightened amount of energy and effort that you think it's going to require. And you're just not using your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's like, no, you forgot. I actually want the result of this. And the last thing I'm going to say before we dive into more of the solution tactics that you can implement is that those of us that are a type A tendency and we're very driven, we often have a very rebellious side. My mind often tells me, do not tell me what to do. I do not like being told what to do. Now, I don't think most people like being told what to do, but I have a very strong, like I can almost feel it like a primal resistance to anyone telling me what to do. the crazy part is it's usually me telling me what to do, right? So like when I think about my walk or my podcast example, I'm the one that put record podcasts on the calendar. I actually really enjoy recording the podcast, getting the podcast out there, thinking about the podcast. I enjoy the walk. I enjoy the accomplishment of having that white paper done. I used to be really skilled at technical accounting research. I was actually really good at it, and I did enjoy the problem solving that came with it. And so I would put on my calendar, review white paper, write white paper, record podcast, go for a walk, because I'm the one that wanted the result of it. But my brain would be like, don't you dare tell me what to do, as if someone was making me do the thing that I wanted to do. And so as we transition to more of the solutions, one of the things that I love to remind myself on the regular, I remind myself of this all the time, by the way, is that I get to do anything I want. I get to do anything I want. And guess what? When I think about myself an hour from now, I'm like, what is myself an hour from now really thankful I did? She's really thankful I did what was on my calendar and that I don't keep procrastinating. She's really grateful that I recorded the podcast. She's really grateful I went for the walk. She's really grateful that I went to bed tonight, getting everything done that I wanted to get done today. And I remind myself that I do actually want to do this thing. And when I remind myself of that, the thought of needing to eat some popcorn is like, it doesn't really matter. It just doesn't take place in my brain. And so that's how I have gotten out of any transition time eating habits. And the other thing that you can think about, and this is more of just kind of a side note, because I think especially for those of us that have this very strong, don't you dare tell me what to do attitude, which is why I will never, ever, ever, ever tell anyone what they should eat. Because you know what your body wants, what feels best in your body. And you listening to your own self and obeying your own future self, that's a super skill, right? And so for me to tell anyone when, what, and how much to eat is insanity to me, because no one wants to be told what to do. And this is why I just think so often, the majority of the time, diets fail is because you are relying on someone else's brain to tell you when, what, and how much to eat. And eventually all of us will rebel against that because no one wants to be told what to do. And so I remind myself that I get to do anything I want. I get to think anything I want. I get to believe anything I want. I get to feel anything I want. And I get to do anything I want. And I remember hearing someone say once, she said, you don't even have to pay your taxes. And I was like, no. I mean, there's some things you have to do that you actually have to do. And she's like, no, you could just not pay your taxes. She was just using it as an example to remind us that humans, we have complete free will in what we think, in what we feel, and in what we do. And she was like, no, you could not pay your taxes. Now, you might get fined for that. You could potentially maybe go to jail for that, right? And so then all of a sudden, the point was that you could decide not to pay your taxes. Now, there may be consequences. And so if you don't want those consequences, then maybe you do want to pay your taxes. So if you're going to pay your taxes, you might as well tell yourself the truth that you do actually want to pay your taxes. And I can't tell you how many times I reminded myself of this when I had my first son, Ben, and he was a newborn and he was not sleeping well. And we got into some bad sleeping habits that now we have overcome with our second two children. And I remember at the time and him being up for like the fourth time in the middle of the night. And I remember thinking, I do not want to get up right now. And then I remember thinking in that moment, well, the alternative is he cries. And there is nothing worse to me than like a crying baby. I have like a visceral response in my body. And I was like, no, I do actually want to get up right now and go feed him. And so when I remind myself of this, like I have complete free will. I could just lay in my bed and not get up, but I actually wanted to get up. And so reminding yourself that you get to do anything you want. There's a difficult conversation you need to have or you want to have with someone in the office. Like you don't have to actually have that. What's the consequence? Do you maybe get fired? Do you have a more tumultuous working relationship? Maybe. But if those are the consequences and you don't want those consequences, then telling yourself the truth that you do actually want to have that difficult conversation with your coworker, you do actually want the result of that problem being solved, whatever that problem is, Tell yourself that truth. And when you remind yourself, I don't have to do this, but I want to do that, all of the sudden, the desire for, well, but I need some snacks first, all of the sudden that desire, it's like it completely vanishes. So that is where I want to start as far as the solutions, is reminding yourself that you get to do anything you want. No one's making me go for a walk. No one's making me record this podcast. It's just the primitive, childlike part of my brain that will sometimes tell me, but I don't want to. It's so hard. It takes so much energy and effort. And when I remind myself, hold on though, that's not even true. I do actually want this. All of a sudden, the desire to eat as a distraction mechanism is gone. So I love to think about me hitting the pillow tonight. When I'm crawling into bed tonight, what am I so grateful that I did? What are you so grateful that you did? Often we talk about and hear about in self-help and self-development, thinking about your future self. Now, thinking about your future self is great when you're thinking about yourself 6 months from now, a year from now, 3 years from now, 10 years from now. I think about myself dying. I think about myself being 60 years old, but I also think about my future self 15 minutes from now. That is also your future self. So think about you when you want to eat when you're not hungry, when you want to eat food that you know isn't going to feel good in your body and you want to eat past the point of being satisfied, think about your future self just 15 minutes from now, just 30 minutes from now. Think about yourself going to bed tonight. What are you so grateful that you did? And then reminding yourself, do you want the result of doing this project? Do you want the result of recording this podcast episode? Do you want the result of going to bed at 9 o'clock tonight instead of 10 o'clock tonight? Do you want the result of allowing a vibration of an urge to be in your body and not answering it with food when you're not hungry? Do you want the result of having this difficult conversation with your partner or your child or your coworker? Even though this activity that your brain has a negative anticipation about, even though that activity might have some emotions involved, it might be maybe a little more emotionally challenging, do you want to do that activity with some physical discomfort of overeating to top it all off? For me, that answer is always no. And here's the glorious magic of asking yourself some of these very simple questions. When you ask yourself, do I want the result of this activity? How do I want to feel 30 minutes from now? What am I going to be so grateful that I did when I hit the pillow tonight? When you ask yourself these questions, you move the energy and the effort from your primitive part of your brain to your prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex part of your brain, that's the part of your brain that thinks about the future. That's the part of your brain that connects to your naturally thin self. That's the part of your brain that knows that when you eat this, you're not going to feel physically good and you might as well have the difficult conversation without adding some physical discomfort on top of it. That's the part of your brain that has your best interest in heart. So when you ask yourself these questions, you automatically turn on that part of your brain because your primitive brain is very concerned with the here and now. And it is very dramatic about the here and now. It is like, this is going to be so hard. It's going to be terrible. It's going to take so much energy. It's going to be way worse than it actually is. Have you ever anticipated having a difficult conversation with someone and your brain has made it this monstrosity of a uncomfortable situation? And then you go and you engage with someone and you have the difficult conversation. And yes, it was maybe challenging, but it was nowhere near as challenging as your brain's anticipation of it, right? My brain creates a very dramatic story about something that it thinks is going to be really challenging in the future. And then you go and you have that difficult conversation. You're like, whoa, that wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was, right? That's only because your primitive brain made it out to be something way different than it was, because our brains are not truth tellers. And so when you ask yourself, do I want the result of having accomplished this thing? Yes or no? And then ask yourself, do I want it with or without the physical discomfort of overeating and then having the regret of overeating? When I remind myself, no, I just want the result. And then I get to decide how I want to be in the doing of the thing. I get to decide, how do I want to be in the recording of the episode? How do I want to be in the walk I'm going to have? How do I want to be in the writing of the white paper? How do I want to be in the difficult conversation? Right? When I'm doing these things, when I'm recording a podcast, or when I used to be reviewing financial statements and then something wouldn't make sense. And I remember having pieces of paper out in front of me and be reviewing the statements. I'd be like, something doesn't make sense. And then before I solve this, my brain would be like, look, peanut M&amps, let's go get some of those, right? Rather than, hold on, how do I want to be solving this problem right now? And do I want to be solving this with even the slightest bit of physical discomfort from food? When ironically, when you are feeling physically in your body alive and vibrant and energized and radiant, what happens then is your brain isn't distracted with even the slightest bit of physical discomfort. Your brain is actually even more efficient. And this subtle transition time eating habit, if you can break that, you can break even the slightest procrastination techniques that your primitive brain offers up to you by simply knowing how to use your prefrontal cortex to tell your primitive brain what to do in those moments. You can truly put an end to procrastinating, right? You do actually want to do the thing that your brain has a negative anticipation about, right? So remind yourself of that and remind yourself what you will be so grateful for that you did when you hit the pillow tonight. This is also why with food, it is really important to make decisions in advance. And when I say make decisions in advance, I teach you all something called the buckets, which is simply deciding how hungry do I want to be before I eat? How do I want to feel when I'm done eating? And then what food will allow me to feel that way when I'm done eating? And you can even give yourself a bunch of options. And so when I think about the buckets, there's like 3 buckets, and it's for each time you're hungry throughout the day. How hungry do I want to be? Scale of 1 to 10. How do I want to feel when I'm done eating? And being really, really clear and vivid and using very nuanced satisfaction language in that decision, and then deciding what food allows you to feel that way. When you do that, you are using your prefrontal cortex to make those decisions. You are thinking about your future naturally thin self. And when you've made those decisions in advance, then it makes it so much easier to catch the subtle, but like just a little bit of popcorn. Just a few more pieces of chocolate, even though I'm not hungry, right? When your primitive brain wants to lie to you, it's so much easier to catch it because you already have set up for your day. No, I'm going to eat when I'm at a hunger level of an 8. But then when your brain's like, no, well, I'm at a hunger of a 5. I'm like kind of a little bit hungry. It's so much easier for you to catch that, oh no, in that moment, I'm not eating right now because my primitive brain is just telling me that we should eat because I don't want to do the next activity on my to-do list. It's so much easier to catch those moments when you've made the decisions around how you want to eat for the day in advance and reminding yourself that you're the one making those decisions. You're the one making those decisions with the highest part of your brain that really has your best interests at heart, because it is not about the food. It's about overcoming your own brain telling you these sneaky little lies. And when you have the skill of using your prefrontal cortex to really redirect and tell your primitive brain, like, no, that's just not true. I don't want to listen to you right now. You have truly developed a super skill. And reminding your brain as well. I used to tell myself this all of the time. When my brain would be like, well, just a little bit. It doesn't really matter anyways. I would remind my brain, hold on. These peanut M&Ms right now, they're not going to solve the dread. These peanut M&Ms, they're not going to solve the anxiety. They're not going to solve even the slightest bit of overwhelm. The food is not going to solve whatever my primitive brain is telling me right now. And when you answer even the slightest bit of dread or anxiety or overwhelm with food, then you're giving the dread way more credit than it deserves. And then what can happen then is you get into a cycle of believing you need to answer the dread or answer the anxiety or answer the overwhelm with food. And when it gets way more credit than it deserves, and you miss out on the opportunity of using your prefrontal cortex to manage your primitive brain, it can build and build and build, and it can turn into intense restlessness that for me, sometimes I'll notice like all of a sudden I'll be like grabbing my phone, which I'm not very attached to normally, but I'll be like grabbing it, like checking Gmail, like my spammy Gmail, or like searching for like, did anyone like post a Marco Polo for me to watch? I only have 2 friends that we do, well, actually 3 friends that we do Marco Polo on. And I'll be like, did someone send me a message? And I'll just be like really like jittery, like looking for my Gmail to send me what? I have no idea, right? But it's just turned into intense restlessness because I have let that dread build. I have let that angst build. I have let that anxiety build by not reminding my primitive brain who's in charge. And my prefrontal cortex is in charge. My primitive brain is not in charge. And so I love to remind myself, yo, primitive brain, you are not a truth teller. It just isn't true. And I have a podcast episode I'm going to do for all of you coming up where we're going to talk more about the subtleties and not so subtleties of your brain versus your mind, because your brain is simply a structure that is in your skull. But you, the part of you that can ask yourself questions, that can think about the future, that can tune into your deepest desires, that can catch your brain not telling you the truth, the part of your brain that can direct yourself to think about, to imagine, to create, that part of you, that is your mind. Your mind, you, the essence of you, is the director of your own brain. It is you piloting and using the structure, the physical structure of your brain to create what you want in your life, and managing and directing your brain to serve you. That is you operating your mind. That is you as the pilot of your brain. And it is essential to becoming naturally thin. It is essential to you knowing how to use the structure of your brain to serve you, how to be able to change your thoughts, to be able to change your feelings. That is your mind at work, to be able to use the structure of your brain to truly create any result you want. And do not underestimate the power of your brain in even the most subtle moments, even these most subtle transition time eating habits. When you are able to pilot your own brain, to redirect your own brain by using these subtleties, these transition time eating habits, that is where the skill is built. There isn't like one magic moment where it happens. You build the skill in these little moments. So be aware of any time your brain is telling you that you should eat when you're not hungry, to eat past the point of being satisfied, or eat food that doesn't serve you, especially in these transition times, and use those moments to redirect your brain. And the last thing I'm going to say is that a lot of us that have this type of personality, a very like go-getter, ambitious, driven, type A personality, and we are really successful, we think that the way to overcome this part of our brain is to like plow through, is to do more, to outwork, to use more willpower, to do better than other people, to put in more time than other people. It's why we're often drawn to strict diets, to meal plans, to intense exercise regimes, because it's something to do. But being naturally thin isn't about more doing. It's actually about less doing. Less eating in a way that doesn't serve you, less eating when you're not hungry, less eating past the point of being satisfied, less thinking about food, less obsessing. And the only way to do all of that, to think about food only when you're hungry, and to easily stop when you're satisfied, and to not think about food other than that, the only way to do that is to have this skill of directing, of managing your own mind, to be the pilot of your own brain. And when you are able to do that in these subtle moments, that skill compounds. And then you'll start to notice one day that you just don't procrastinate really at all. And so use these transition time eating habits to develop this skill. All right, my friends, if you are enjoying the podcast, if you're getting a lot out of the podcast episode, please take a minute to write a review and leave a review. That helps other women find the podcast so that they too can implement what they are learning here, so that we can all put an end to the diet insanity, so that all of us get to live with the freedom of being naturally thin and the body that goes along with it. All right, my friends, have a beautiful week, and I will talk to you all next time. Friend, if you are loving what you are learning here on the podcast, you have to come check out my Naturally Thin for Life program. It is my on-demand lifetime access program where I teach you brand new concepts not taught here on the podcast. And I will walk you through exactly how to implement all of the tools I teach you here so that they become just a part of you. You will learn exactly how to understand your specific brain and your specific body so that you become naturally thin for the rest of your life and you no longer struggle with your weight. Inside of the Naturally Thin for Life program, you can also receive live help so that you consistently make progress and reach your goal. I will teach you how to accelerate your naturally thin journey in a sustainable way so that the change becomes permanent. The best part is that it's risk-free. You either love it or I will give you your money back. If you are ready to finally be naturally thin for life, join us at lauradixoncoaching.com/work with me. That's LAURADIXON coaching.com and click on the Work With Me tab. I cannot wait to see you there.